Has the government used individual citizens, groups, even whole cities as test subjects without telling them what was going on? After decades of secrecy, is it possible that the truth about American citizens being used as scientific guinea pigs is finally coming out? We'll try to navigate these murky waters in just a moment. For years, rumors of bizarre secret government experiments have surfaced, filtering into the public media from strange and unlikely sources. For example, Nazi doctors on trial in Nuremberg following World War II sought to justify their actions by pointing to an experiment conducted in Chicago prisons in which 400 prisoners were infected with malaria in order to study the effects of new and experimental drugs. Whether or not the prisoners were told what was happening to them is still open to question, but this was hardly the beginning of such reports. One of the more disturbing experiments was allegedly undertaken in 1931 when a single pathologist, Dr. Cornelius Rhodes of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Investigations, according to reports, knowingly infected his human subjects with cancer.
Dr. Rhodes' attitude towards his subjects is apparent in a letter used as the basis for a criminal investigation into his actions.
What we need is not public health work, but a tidal wave or something to totally exterminate the population.
The criminal case was dismissed, however, by the prosecutor appointed by the North American governor of Puerto Rico. His reason was that Rhodes was merely mentally ill or a person of few scruples.
Dr. Rhodes went on to direct the establishment of U.S. Army chemical warfare laboratories in Maryland, Utah, and the Panama Canal Zone.
This doctor, who was described as mentally ill, was subsequently awarded the Legion of Merit and appointed to the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission.
Atomic energy, of course, gave the entire world something new and terribly frightening to think about, and the people at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, a 560-square-mile manufacturing plant in southeastern Washington, apparently thought their friends and neighbors in the great Northwest wouldn't mind being used as subjects.
One of the largest intentional releases of radiation in history took place at Hanford in 1949. Known as the Green Run, it was purposely kept from the public for nearly 40 years. Later, documents released by the Department of Energy show that Hanford had secretly released 8,000 curies of radioactive iodine. Allegedly, the radiation was released to monitor the radioactive plume stretching across Oregon and Washington. This was done in order to evaluate equipment used for detecting Soviet plutonium plants. No one living downwind from Hanford was ever warned or evacuated, and the Green Run was only one release. To give you some idea of what was going on at Hanford, the 3 Mile Island accident vented between 15 and 24 curies of radioactive iodine. Between 1944 and 1947, Hanford emitted an estimated 685,000 curies of radiation into the environment. That is a staggering amount.
To bring the point a little closer to home, there have been reports recently of contrails, trails of gaseous substances left in the wake of jet planes flying high above certain areas of the country.
A mysterious sickness seems to be centered around these contrails left by KC-135s and KC-10 aerial tankers that were supposedly seeding clouds. Officially, the Air Force denies it is involved in anything associated with these sightings, but in a recent article, Tommy Farmer, former engineering technician with Raytheon Missile Systems, says he has collected samples of what he calls angel hair, sprayed by the mystery aircraft on 6 occasions since February of 1998.
No one knows where the planes are coming from or where they land when they're finished. However, some reports indicate that the phenomenon is weather modification related, and the Air Force has said the military can find ways to own the weather by the year 2025. So what it comes down to is all of this is supposed to be for our own good, or for the sake of national security, whether we like it or not. But if that's the case, why aren't we being told about it? Even with World War II raging and the obvious need for security, one of the most bizarre government experiments of all time took place right here at the Philadelphia Naval Station, and the results will shock and mystify those who were part of it. The story actually begins in January of 1956. A man by the name of Morris K. Jessup, a former university mathematics and astronomy instructor with a keen interest in Einstein's unified field theory, received the first of 2 letters from a man who signed himself Carlos Miguel Allende, or Carl Allen. In these rambling, sometimes almost incoherent letters, Allen warned Jessup to forget his interest in the unified field theory, stating that the U.S. Navy had already tried it on a destroyer-type ship in 1943.
The result was, and stands today as proof, that the unified field theory, to a certain extent, is correct. The result was complete invisibility of a ship and all of its crew.
Jessup assumed the letter came to him in response to a book he had published in 1955 called The Case for the UFO. The book had become the hot topic of the cocktail circuit in Washington, D.C., and an annotated copy even found its way to the Office of Naval Research, where the notations in the margins and above and below the text drew the attention of 2 ONR officers. The officers claimed that their interest was purely personal and had nothing to do with naval research. Still, they called Jessup in to evaluate the notations. Jessup received another letter from Allende within just a few days of the first. He opened his mail and read,
I wish to mention that somehow, also, the experimental ship disappeared from its Philadelphia dock and only a very few minutes later appeared at its other dock in the Norfolk Portsmouth area. This was distinctly and clearly identified as being that place, but the ship then again disappeared and went back to the Philadelphia dock in only a very few minutes.
That assertion must have been a jolt to Jessup, since the 2 naval stations are some 400 miles apart. It would take days, not minutes, to get a destroyer-type vessel from one berth to the other and back. The letters seemed alternately desperate and angry, occasionally even pleading, and inexplicably, Jessup turned the letters over to the 2 naval officers who had the annotated copy of his book. He was sure, he told them, that at least some of the notations were Allende's. Whether or not Jessup ever made any further inquiries is unknown. His involvement ended on the evening of April 20th, 1959, when he was found dead in his station wagon in Dade County Park in Florida. Jessup, it appeared, had committed suicide. Jessup's friends insisted he was not the kind of man to commit suicide, but nothing was ever found to suggest anything else. But one thing was certain. In the 3 years since he received the first letter from Allende until his death, Jessup had been the main factor in seeing to it that the tight lid of secrecy surrounding the Philadelphia experiment was ripped away. The Navy, while insisting no such experiment ever took place, was nevertheless suddenly very interested in anyone requesting information about the USS Eldridge. And nearly 30 years later, this man, Alfred Bielek, would make it all but impossible to put the lid of secrecy back in place.
My original family name is Edward Cameron. When I first became aware of my involvement with the Philadelphia experiment in January of 1988, I had no idea how extensive my use by the government had been, nor where my research would lead. But it includes the Philadelphia experiment, the Montauk Project, mind control, some discussion of aliens, and it all fits together. Trying to understand how they fit together in the complex web that has been created is the purpose of my bringing to you vital information which has been kept from you by your government and the media.
What was the Philadelphia experiment exactly? And why would the U.S. Navy have been spearheading the research in the first place?
At the time that the Philadelphia experiment was supposed to have taken place, German U-boats were destroying nearly half of the shipping that was going across the Atlantic. Both the British Admiralty and the U.S. Navy were desperate in finding a way of combating this lethal threat. If scientists of the caliber of Albert Einstein and Nikola Tesla had even remotely suggested the possibility of turning a large naval ship invisible, even if it was only invisible to enemy radar, the admirals would have certainly have decided to explore that option.
The stated purpose of the experiment was to prove whether or not you could make a ship invisible to radar. The The original purpose was optical invisibility. Two scientists came forth with unproven theories which became part of this experiment. By 1943 in the United States, Einstein's concept of the ideas of the interaction of electricity, gravity, and magnetism seemed suited to the idea of electronic camouflage. But implementation of the theory would require the use of some of the concepts of another great scientist, Nikola Tesla. Tesla was the project originator and its first director. Einstein and others, including Dr. John von Neumann, worked together to perfect the theory. All of these men worked together very closely on this project, and I was privileged to work with them in my original Edward Cameron timeline.
The stage was now set for a journey into unexplored realms of science. But did the Navy, or even the scientists, know it would also be a journey into the future? Did any of them really believe it was possible for a massive warship to just suddenly become invisible? And who exactly is Ed Cameron? And what does his so-called timeline have to do with anything? Believe me, making the ship invisible is the easiest thing to believe. We'll be back in a moment with the really exciting part of the story. The ship chosen for the experiment was a recently commissioned destroyer escort named the USS Eldridge. So far as can be determined, none of the 180-plus men aboard the ship were told what the test was all about. All they knew was that they were going to make us invisible. But was this something the government would take seriously, even if scientists proposed it?
In the late 1970s, Dr. James Coram recruited a group of scientists, just for fun, to see if there was any scientific basis for the events that were supposed to have taken place during the Philadelphia experiment. To their astonishment, there was. In a laboratory, they were able to replicate radar invisibility using what is known as Tesla's egg of Columbus. So, it is entirely plausible that in 1943, they had the sufficient knowledge to conduct the Philadelphia experiment. In fact, from what was known of the technology, it would have been derelict behavior of the Defense Science Research Board not to have conducted such experiments.
The device invented by Tesla for producing high voltages with low current is today used in one form or another in most radio and TV sets. It permits weak circuits to sustain currents of almost any magnitude. His theories were perfect for the task at hand, but Tesla became disenchanted with the entire project. He was convinced that his inventions were being appropriated for purposes not beneficial to mankind.
The experiment was originally called Project Rainbow after it was classified, and it was executed in two parts. The trial run from the standpoint of invisibility went very well, but the effect on the sailors on deck was horrific. Sailors were sick, some were completely disoriented, but the objectives and goals of invisibility had been achieved. The decision was made to go ahead with the second phase of this test, with the test crew and two scientists on board.